Hi, this is Lamar, and you're listening to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom. Getting to Third Space is produced by Tenacious Change, a consultancy committed to creating resilient, nonprofit organizations. This podcast is available on Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and Apple Podcasts. Wherever you listen to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom, be sure to subscribe to hear about new episodes when they become available. Also, be sure to share this podcast with friends, colleagues, and family. The more people join us, the quicker we get to third space as a society.
Well, Happy New Year, Lamar.
Happy New Year back to you, man.
Oh,
How
hey.
you doing?
Well, I'm doing okay. You know, I survived coming into the new year. That's always a good thing. But hey, I'm just wondering. So, you know, this is the time when people make New Year's resolutions, right? So did you make any resolutions for this year?
I didn't make so much resolutions, but I have set a couple of goals. All right. And you can call them resolutions if you want, but I'm going to prefer to think of them as goals. The first thing is I didn't do near as much traveling as I wanted to do, primarily because of just some life situations and family situations that were kind of taking place during the time we typically travel. So that kind of changed things. So I want to do a little bit more traveling. My wife and I do camping and RVing as well, and that kind of slowed down this past summer. So that we want to rebuild that part of our life. The other thing that I have been challenging myself on is to get more involved in my community. I've been reading some work, some of that by Andrew Whitehead, who you and I have shared some books back and forth about. But the idea of if you want to have impact, you need to be part of the community, part of the kind of the environment. So I'm trying to be more aware and understanding and visible in my small community. Not in any formal way, but more informally, you know, attending meetings, and just getting a sense of kind of what's happening, in the small world around me. So that's another goal that I have this year. How about you?
Well, so one of the things we really like to do over the holiday break is watch movies that we really enjoy. Many of them are holiday movies, and a couple of years ago, we stumbled across one that we have just really come to love because it's a very sweet alternative retelling of the Santa Claus story. Now, I'm really drawn to it, not because of the title of the movie, which happens to be Klaus, by the way, but because it's just so well done and it is such a really sweet story. And we were watching it again this year, and a line jumped out at me that I don't think I've really heard or didn't really catch me before. The line was, "A true act of goodwill always sparks another." And I don't really do much with resolutions either, but if I were to have a resolution this year, it would be to try to act with goodwill more often than what I do. And I'm not to say that I go around trying to irritate the snot out of people or anything like that, but it's just one of those aspirational things that this is a time right now that is creating a lot of anxiety for people. And
that's true.
And you know, the next few months are going to be challenging months, and so if I can spark goodwill in another by engaging in an act of goodwill myself, you know, why not? Why not give that a try? So that, and you know, I hope to continue to play golf this year. You know, my favorite sport, which is kind of a non-sport for you, I understand.
Is it really a sport?
Is it really? But I'm hoping to do more of that, or at least the same level of that, in the coming year. So that's it.
Great goals.
Yeah,
very good.
Yeah,
and something that we share that we will continue here the first part of this year is watching our favorite teams.
That's right.
take it to the court, right?
Well, of course, it's our favorite teams. They all happen to start with the word H, the Hawkeyes.
That's correct.
Except, yeah. The Citrus Bowl.
There is that the Kansas City Chiefs and the Green Bay Packer thing, but hey, we can embrace the world, right?
But we're still grieving the Citrus Bowl performance of the Iowa Hawkeyes, right?
Performance? Okay, I'll go with that. I loved to watch it for a few minutes, and then I didn't.
Yeah, it was truly sad. So, well, anyway.
Listen, it's going to be a good year. I think you're right. It's going to be a challenge of a year for our country and for us. And I think being able to stay connected with our goals and our people, and keeping our minds on the positive track, I think that's a wise thing.
Yeah. Well, and of course, here we are. It's a new year. It's a new season of getting to Lamar, getting to third space with Lamar and Tom. I probably get to Lamar every now and then, but but this is season 2, episode 1 of Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom. And actually, this is a special one for a couple of reasons. One is because we have our first guest of 2024, or season 2. And the other thing is that we have had such an amazing conversation with our guest, which we recorded just, in all transparency, we recorded just a few minutes ago. We've decided we're going to break it into 2 podcasts. And so today we're going to do part 1 of the podcast. And then in a couple of weeks, we will drop part 2 as well. So Lamar, ask me about who our guest is.
Tom, who do we have as a special guest today?
Hey, Lamar, thanks for asking. Appreciate that. So, Seth Kaplan is going to be joining us today in this podcast. He is a leading expert on what is known as fragile states. Now, of course, we will be asking him to tell us more about what this means, but I'm particularly excited he is here because of his new book, Fragile Neighborhoods: Repairing American Society, One Zip Code at a Time. So I've had a chance, and I think you've had a chance to read Seth's book, and we've had a little bit of time to absorb it. One of the things that really grabbed me about Seth's work is his focus on building trust and relationships. We've talked about these 2 things as well in this podcast, and what we see of Seth's work on these has really resonated with us. So I got to know Seth through a mutual acquaintance, and in fact, we got together for coffee in late November of last year, and it turns out that we only live a couple of neighborhoods apart here in Maryland. And I was really pleased during that coffee chat. He learned that we had a podcast, and he offered to come on with us. And so, that's what he is doing. Before he joins us, let me tell our listeners a bit more about Seth. Seth Kaplan holds a number of positions related to his expertise on fragile states. He is a professorial lecturer in the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He's a senior advisor for the Institute for Integrated Transitions and a consultant to multilateral organizations such as the World Bank, the U.S. State Department, U.S. Agency for International Development, or what we also know as USAID, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He works with a number of developing country governments and other NGOs as well. So welcome, Seth. We are really so pleased to have you join us today.
Thrilled to be here. Thank you so much.
So, Seth, we've been talking about our New Year's resolutions, and so we're wondering, do you do a New Year's resolution? And if so, would you be willing to share it with us?
Well, I tend to think a little bit, I tend not to do New Year's resolutions. I tend instead to think of my life as a series of chapters or episodes. Sometimes the episodes are within the chapters. And when I get to like an end of something, I tend to take a pause, and I spend a lot of time thinking, exploring, you could say intellectually wandering, thinking about what I should do next. So I've just spent the last half a year writing, speaking, working really hard on promoting my book, Fragile Neighborhoods. And while I have more to do, trips and more talking about it in the next many months, it will be much less intense. And so I certainly need a pause, a reflection, a period of reflection to think hard about where do I go from here to build on the book, to build on what I've been doing around the book. And so less a resolution and more understanding that I have not an unlimited, but not a short. I have a certain number of months that I need to think hard about what am I doing next. So I would say not a resolution, but a proactive introspection and consideration of what do I do to move forward.
Very nice. Well, we look forward to seeing what is next for you.
Seth, we want to hear more about fragile states and your new book, Fragile Neighborhoods. But first, we thought it would be good to remind our listeners about how we approach conversations here on Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom. We've created this podcast recognizing that in our current climate of political divisions and culture war issues, that is challenging for us individually and corporately to come together with civil dialogue and discourse. It's not an easy thing to do. And the concept of the third space refers to an idea where we create a space that is respectful. It's a space that is safe, is conducive to conversation and dialogue. And it's a place you could come even when you disagree with each other. Our focus is more about the process of civil conversation and dialogue. And we're interested in knowing how people accomplish this kind of a civil conversation, even in the face of strong disagreement. So today we're going to focus on some basic questions about the intersection of your work in fragile states and neighborhoods in civil conversation. Of course, some of your responses may prompt some follow-up questions. And Tom and I will interject if we need to. Seth, before we ask you about the role of civil dialogue in your work, we'd like to know a little bit more about the nature of your work. What is fragile state, and kind of what is it that you do around this concept and these issues?
For about the last 15 years or so, I have been very focused on fragile states. Well, first, what is a fragile state? If you look at the world's map, there's around 200 countries. Roughly 1/3 of them are fragile. What do we mean when we say fragile? Fragile, there's many ways to define it. I think most people would define it by what they see as lacking, missing, or problematic, and therefore they very much focus on technical solutions. So I tend to think of countries based upon my years of work and living in many, many places that the problems are really relational. And therefore, when we talk about fragility, we talk about countries that are highly politically unstable. For me, that means there's something amiss in their relationships. There's something that's lacking in their social cohesion. And my work is really focused on finding ways to improve social cohesion, find institutions or governing structures or dialogues or coalitions or initiatives that will bring people together around change that will basically make things less violent, and less likely to become violent, or in some cases, end violence. Because think I work on Libya, I work on Nigeria. Those are two countries I work very actively on. In Nigeria, just to be very practical, I work on a part of the country with about 25 million people. That's the Eastern Middle Belt, the middle part of the country on the east side. 5 states, I have people on the ground, and very practically, we're trying to create social covenants of top leaders at the level of the state. That's several million people. So it's the top traditional, religious, economic, political leaders. We're looking at the institutions, the grievance management system, the resource management system. And basically, when those don't work well, small disagreements tend to become large disagreements, and eventually they become group-based, identity-based, and violent. And so if there's enough cohesion, enough bridging institutions, enough cooperation to make the management of resources better and to make the ability to manage grievances better, conflicts will be managed. They'll be seen as managed equitably. There'll be avenues for people to cooperate to solve the problems between them. And what we see is rising violence for roughly 15 years will be going down. And so that's really an example of my work. My work is to think horizontal, think about relationships, think about the nature of institutions, think about how do I bring people together, and how do we come up with some creative approaches that other people haven't tried that will strengthen all of those elements.
Oh, thank you. That's very detailed, very very interesting. And you're looking internationally, and you're seeing kind of the indicators that you're looking for that would indicate that there are fragile states and the relationships are maybe tenuous or problematic. When you take a look at where we're at in the U.S., how close do you think we're coming to becoming a fragile state?
Well, my book was really an answer to all the people who asked me, roughly 2015, 2016, 2017, without any prompting. I had person after person after person ask me, because in Washington, D.C., everybody knew me as the fragile states person. I mean, I work on political transitions and other related conflict prevention, but I'm famous for fragile states. They asked me, is the U.S. becoming fragile? And honestly, if you just came back from Sri Lanka, if you just came back from Nigeria, you just came back from the Middle East, you can't imagine the U.S. fragile in the same way. I mean, we've had a constitution that has worked for over 200 years. We have great institutions. They may not be perfect, but they work. They're stable, and technology and business and the material wealth. So clearly, we are not like the countries that I work on. We're not Somalia, we're not Nigeria, and so on and so forth. And so I do not think we will have the type of civil war or high levels of political violence that we see in many parts of the world. I think that's highly unlikely. And so we're not fragile in the way that those are fragile. But I took this question very seriously, and I do what I typically do. I wandered intellectually. I wandered physically. I went to lots of places. I read a lot. I saw what was going on. And I think the key question that we need to be asking ourselves are, we have lots and lots of social problems and political problems that we did not have 2 generations ago. Yes, some things are better than 2 generations ago, but we have in particular, and we had problems 2 generations ago, but we have a whole slew of problems from people with drug deaths, loneliness, depression, disconnection, mistrust, polarization. It's social and it feeds into the political. And we didn't have that 2 generations ago. So I think the really big question that we need to ask ourselves is, what has changed in the nature of our relationships over 2 generations that has led us to have all of these, which are basically downstream from a decay in the social fabric and relationships? If we assume that all the problems I've mentioned are at their heart problems of relationships, and I believe they are, different types of relationships at different levels, then we have to go back and say, well, if we didn't have these types of problems and now we have loads of them and they're all growing in parallel, what has changed? And so that's really what I tried to zero in on in terms of my research, where I went, what I thought about, what types of case studies I looked for, how I approached the problems. And I do believe, unlike fragile states where the problem tends to be macro, locally communities are strong, but the the differences between communities tends to be the problem. Here in America, I really think the biggest weakness and the biggest change in relationships is local. It's basically what is happening in your neighborhoods.
And so you bring up you kind of reduce down to more of a micro level here of basic relationships. Sometimes, I'm in a town of 3,500 people in the middle of Kansas. I've been in other neighborhoods where it's much more concentrated and much larger, and realize that there are challenges in both types of environments. And you talk about relationships being key. Can you kind of define that fragile neighborhood a little bit more? What are some of those relationships that are not maybe as strong or there today that maybe we had a few years ago?
Well, I would first, what is a neighborhood? Loads of Americans live in places that aren't actually neighborhoods. Neighborhoods have an identity. Neighborhoods have boundaries. Neighborhoods have a center. Neighborhoods have local institutions. If listeners or viewers are in a place that has none of those things, they are living in what we might call a placeless landscape, and that there's no obvious place or regular place where they go and meet people who live near them, unless they walk out their door and intentionally on their own go and knock on the doors. If you live in a proper neighborhood, there's places, there's coffee shops, there's restaurants, places to shop, there's houses of worship, there are community schools, civic associations, centers. There's lots of things going on that bring people together. Now, think about my neighborhood as an example. My neighborhood is, and I certainly didn't write the book thinking about where I lived, but if you think about the choices I've made in my life, I've made choices on a personal basis that brought me into places, and then eventually into relationships and a specific neighborhood where there was a fixed set of institutions, where people supported each other, where I felt a sense of warmth. Even my work on fragile states, it wasn't like I planned that. It wasn't like I went to school and I studied that. I wandered the world. I wandered to where places that I wanted to see, and the places that attracted me had warm relationships and made me feel that I was welcome and that I could give. It just felt to me as a very giving, warm, thick relationship, deep relationship places. And that led me to the career on fragile states, and also led me to my neighborhood. So in my neighborhood, unlike most parts of America, maybe in your town it's this way, but certainly not true everywhere, I can go up and down the streets, and I, for the most part, know who lives behind the doors. They may not be my friends, but I have relationships. I have expectations that if I need something, I can knock on their door. If they need something, they can knock on my door. And I can see repeatedly in like the 11 or 12 years that I've been here that there was a need for something. My wife had to go leave town to take care of her mother. I needed help with carpool, basically get my kids back and forth to school. I had 4 different neighbors, 2 mornings, 2 afternoons. We had a problem with my daughter dropping her younger brother on the cement, and his chin is bleeding, and you could just feel it. Took him out of the car and dropped him. He was probably about 1.5 years old at that point. And like, what do? You're immediately like in panic. My wife picks him up without a thought, without even telling us what she was doing. She just took off down the street, and I had no idea where she went. And I didn't know for 45 minutes until she came back. Where did she run to? She went to the nearest nurse. And as it turns out, we know 6, 7, 8 nurses. So I could literally draw a map of my area and tell you where the nurses and doctors are. So when you live in a place in which there are these relationships, there are these norms, there's a sense of willful interdependence brought about by lots and lots of institutions and interactions, and it just becomes a different life. And so I think I've been on a bit on a tangent here to get to your answer, a long way around. But I think when you live in a place where I live, and this is where I think most Americans used to live, in a place where I lived, you just have a very different mindset because you're embedded in trustful, supportive relationships. It's not perfect. Sometimes people know more about each other than you may want, but you have a different mindset. You have a mindset that if I have a need, or I can talk to someone, I have an emergency, whatever it is, I have lots of people around me that are there to support me. And that gives you a whole different mindset, a whole different feeling. And you're much less likely to have a crisis that we have to deal with in a sense of emergency, which is what we do with all crises in America. Emergency, emergency, emergency. You want people to be supported way before they get there. And we're not doing a very good job about that right now.
Well, I think you've touched on a number of things there to answer that question, which I appreciate. I think one of the things that stood out to me as you were kind of describing your experience is you were able to make some choices as far as kind of the neighborhood and the environment that you were wanting to connect with. And I myself able to do that as well. Not everyone has the ability to make those kind of choices. So what can you kind of explain why it's so important to be able to understand this concept of fragile neighborhoods, and how for those who don't maybe have the choices, or don't see the resources, or maybe don't have the resources, how does this concept play out or not play out in the world?
Well, one of the core themes about my book is how unequal we are as a country, simply because based upon where you live. And that is to the point that many people, they can't leave their neighborhood, or if they leave their neighborhood, their options are very limited because of their financial means, because of their social networks, because of their access to opportunity. And so when I say fragile neighborhoods, I don't only mean poor neighborhoods, because you could be materially well off and what I would call socially poor. And you also can be materially not well off, but socially rich. So I'm very much focused on the social dimensions. And I think the worst neighborhoods are neighborhoods that are economically and socially poor. And when I say fragile, I mean, clearly there's a continuum from, you might call anti-fragile, or very dynamic, robust, versus fragile. And so one of the main goals of writing the book was to find ways to uplift these fragile places. And because people can't move, or they can't move to places that are not fragile, we as a society, there are many things that we ought to be doing to make those neighborhoods more socially rich, more opportunity rich. Again, I'm focused on the social, but I believe the economic and social, they're sort of married to each other. They're like different dimensions, and you need to work with both. So for me, fragile is that you're isolated, you're alone, you have very few, if any, institutions around you, whether that's in the home, whether that's on the street, whether that's in a neighborhood, that can support you when you have a need, that make you feel wanted, make you feel that you belong, make you feel loved, and also they provide the networks and the access to the opportunity, the training, the mentoring, the examples of success that people need to thrive. And I think the difference in neighborhoods is especially important the younger you are. There's plenty of data. I mean, I'm not sure how many people realize the gaps, but the average lifespan in America, there's a 40 or 41 year gap between the worst and the best places for living, but also just in terms of social mobility, as well as health, as well as education outcomes, as well as so many indicators are very much neighborhood based. And so when we don't look at neighborhoods and we don't think of things in terms of place, we are basically very much limiting any initiative, any effort to help people. And so my argument is we need to think about neighborhoods, and we need to uplift neighborhoods, and we need to not just think about the individual, because I think thinking about the individual and thinking only about material is very limiting, very constraining in our ability to have an impact.
Well, picking up on this idea of relationships a little bit, in your book, Fragile Neighborhoods, you argue that many people feel really alienated and disconnected in our country, and which is something you just shared again here in response to Lamar. You also suggest that there are 5 institutions that play an outsized role in repairing fragile neighborhoods in American society, and those being community, school, family, church, or religious affiliation, and the physical places where people live or habitat. And building trust and strengthening relationships to create a clear sense of ownership and belonging seem to run through all of these as I read your book. That sense of belonging, you assert, is based on the thickness of the relationship between people in a community. So, Seth, since relationship is central to the approach you advocate, what do you feel is holding us back in American society from doing a better job of building relationships within our neighborhoods and our communities?
Well, first, let's contrast what happens when somebody is strongly involved in a neighborhood versus where they're not, and just think about how that changes their own sense of well-being or their own view of things in their society. If you go back a couple of generations, people would belong to multiple institutions and have relationships when they shopped, relationships when they prayed, relationships when their kids would go to school, relationships also, all these, whether it's the Veterans Association or the hundreds of local associations that were all over the country. I mean, mostly everywhere was thick with these relationships, and people played leadership roles. People showed up at events. People belonged. And what you had was a person would feel that they belonged to that place. Doesn't mean they spent their whole lives there, but they would belong to this place. They would have avenues to participate, avenues to contribute, and they would feel that they had a sense of worth simply by their ability to participate, at times lead, contribute, volunteer, whatever it was. Fast forward 2 generations, and most of that is gone. And so what do most people feel? People feel that they feel powerless. They feel that they don't belong. They feel that the society, the economy, the politics is being done to them, as opposed to where they used to be a feeling that they had a role to play. It's partly because so much has been nationalized. It's partly because a lot of these organizations that exist have been professionalized. It's partly because everything has become very functional. Even faith is so functional today. You go for the sermon, or they cater to a few consumer needs, and there's no community. Community is a completely different. I mean, faith used to be community centric. Today, faith often is functional, very functional. So you can look at even schools. People can send their kids to a local school. So just think about how people are experiencing life every day. So when I think about those institutions, and part of this is based upon research, that when you dig into the research, what are the institutions that have the biggest impact on the basically indicators at the neighborhood level? And I work backwards from looking at a whole stream of different research to figure out what were these most important institutions. And that's where I focus my research. And I think the key thing is, if you look at what people can belong to, they can belong to a civic institution, they can belong to a family, a marriage, and so on and so forth. And then when you talk about trust, I would say trust is built in a very particular case. But what's, I think, missing from much of this conversation, and I could talk about trust building at the level of an organization, because I did have one great example of that. But I think your question alludes to the fact is, if you're involved with lots of these overlapping institutions and activities, you are just, without even thinking about it, unintentionally building trust and building this sense of togetherness with those people around you. And when all those institutions get voided out, why would you trust? The family you grew up in may not be stable. The institutions around you may not be supportive. The school might be somehow alienating, and the shopping is all at a big box retailer. So you basically, there's nothing in your life that on a day in, day out basis, there are probably a couple of people, could be someone in your home, it could be some neighbors, but your landscape is dominated by relationships that are not really relationships. They're transactions, and sometimes they're not supportive at all. They might just be alienated by they might be alienating by how things are done or what you're exposed to. So why would you grow up, or why would you live with trust? And I think this is almost like, it's just common sense. People shouldn't be trustful if that's their environment. And yet we ask ourselves, how do we get here? I mean, if you just walk around and see how people are living, I think there's plenty of evidence that this is the society we designed. We created a society that made sense on each of the levels. But when you put it together, it just generates a lack of trust, isolation, loneliness, and lots of other negative outcomes.
So a lot of what you're saying reminds me of the little town that I grew up in Iowa, population 750. You know, the everything in that little community evolved around the churches in town, the school in town. I mean, whenever the school had a sporting event, almost the entire town showed up, or a play or a concert, something like that. And so I, for many years, didn't know that anything really existed outside of my little tiny town. And so when I hear you talk about the thick relationships, and I hear you talk about how trust just happens in the context of that, that's what I think of, is that small, very small town that I grew up in. You also mentioned in your book that neither a top-down nor bottom-up approach work particularly well in repairing American society. And I was intrigued by that, because I have been a bottom-up guy, you know, for most of my career, you know, really believing that the best change that happens, and the most sustainable change or durable change, happens when it is really bottom up. And you introduced the concept of the sideways approach. So can you say more about what the sideways approach is? I think this is going to be a new term for a lot of the people that listen into this podcast.
Well, let me answer that. I think that's actually two points there. So first, I mean, my argument in the book is that a lot of people grew up, whether it was in a city or a suburb or a town, in the type of environment that you grew up with. That's how people grew up, and it was not intentional. It was simply because people didn't have cars. Things were not regionalized or nationalized, and a lot of things, basically, we lived. Every place was local, and we were centered on the local, and that has all changed. And so one of my main arguments is, if we want to create a country in which everybody lives in a flourishing neighborhood, a flourishing place, which is the type of supportive environment that I mentioned, we're not going to go back. We only can go forward, but there's a lot of things we could do to intentionally recreate the benefits of the place you grew up in, Tom. I don't think it would be 750 people, but let's suppose 5 to 10,000 people in an identifiable neighborhood. If the physical landscape and the institutions were designed, even the government was designed with the idea that nurturing strong neighborhood-based communities mattered for well-being, so many things about what we do, from urban planning to how money is spent by the government, to the nature of philanthropy, to the nature of civil society, would change. So I think, again, if we're not intentional, we unintentionally create a whole landscape that leaves us where we are. So that's one argument. So when I talk about horizontal or sideways, it actually has two meanings. One is, in any particular place, let's start off by thinking about the relationships between people. that to me is horizontal. We have to always think that society, whether it's in a one place or across the country, society is very horizontal. And the relationships in a place, and for me, I come from the peace building or the peacemaking or conflict prevention space. We're very much thinking inclusive. So if I think of a neighborhood, I'm thinking everybody in the neighborhood, what is it to ensure that everyone is involved with thick relationships? So that's one. And then on the larger scale, again, we need to think across the whole landscape, 330 million Americans. How are we going to reach all those people? We're not going to reach it with another policy or another government initiative. We need to reach it in the fact that every neighborhood, every place is thriving in the sense that people can be embedded in, I hate to use the word embedded and embodied, but embedded and embodied relationships, embodied institutions, so that they have a sense of belonging. It shouldn't limit them. They can always leave. We're not talking about any types of constraints, but to the extent that we think about a thriving country in a horizontal manner, and we think that each place success depends upon relationships. Now, again, initiatives are great, so you may start bottom up, but if you think horizontal, you're thinking about somehow incorporating a neighborhood and then incorporating all the neighborhoods. That's what I mean by sideways and horizontal.
Seth, in a recent article you wrote for the Stand for Social Innovation, you wrote about the role of nonprofits in building trust. And Tom and I, the majority of our careers has been in nonprofits, and we know the challenges as well as the expectations and some of the shortcomings and things that you face. What do you see as the greatest obstacle for nonprofits, in building trust? And trust is such a huge part of building relationships.
Well, I think the best thing is, let's give an example. So in my research, I looked at Life Remodeled in Detroit. Now, Life Remodeled, great organization, small, I mean, not large by any means. It's basically started off as a spin-off from the guy was a pastor, wanted to do the church's work in with real people in real places. And so basically started with that idea, eventually left running a church and started just by helping individual householders, and then streets, neighborhoods, beautifying, cleaning up. Detroit is very unusual. If you haven't seen the physical landscape, it's hard to imagine a city that's lost 2/3 of its population and that has loads of neighborhoods that either don't exist or have a scattering of decayed or decaying houses with empty stretches of basically that have turned into grass and trees. And so it's a little bit like a not quite a post-war situation, but it looks a little bit like that in terms of the devastation. And he's doing this beautifying work, and he's helping people fix roofs and fix or replace boilers. And he's doing this for many years, and he's getting thousands, even 10,000 volunteers for his annual 6-day initiative. And he's building a lot of relationships with people. And he thinks because he's helping them and because they're nice to him, and he's seen them over and over again, he thinks that they trust him. And then he takes a step to do a much bigger initiative. The city needs to downsize the school system, and has this absolutely beautiful, huge middle school that it basically wants to close down, but instead it offers this guy, Chris Lambert and Life Remodeled. Chris and Life Remodeled, I will give you this on a long-term lease at a very low price, as long as you maintain it, renovate it, with the idea that you're going to create a neighborhood hub. A neighborhood hub sounds like a great idea. You're going to a poor area, you're bringing all these organizations, you're bringing support, you're bringing opportunity, you're bringing things for the kids. Goes in and he announces that he's doing this, what you would think people would view as an incredible thing, and everyone basically slams him. They're very mistrustful. They're very angry. They have all sorts of names thrown at him and people work in his organization when he goes to a community meeting. And at the beginning, he's baffled. Didn't these people trust me? Well, I think there's a few reasons why he was misunderstanding the situation. One, when you give things to people, well, they'll trust you. They'll take your thing. That's not a very deep level of trust. You're giving and they're taking. Here, he was taking over the most important asset, the most important building in the neighborhood. And he was basically asking them to be in a long-term relationship with him. That's completely different. Second level is that he wasn't from the place. He wasn't even from their race. Most people there were black, and he was a white guy who originally wasn't even from the city. I believe he's from Indiana. And so there was these multiple reasons why they were mistrustful. So he had to, through trial and error, he had a very good advisor, someone who worked for him at the time that spun off and started his own organization, a guy named Dwan. And Dwan understood where people were coming from, even though he was also called lots of names. And he had to learn by trial and error, what was it that really meant building trust? And what did he do to build trust? First, he went around and forget the big meeting, forget all the large groups, because large groups, people go up and they perform and people come from all places. They may not be local. He went local. He went street by street and he basically broke bread with people. He sat down with people. He talked with people and he made the rounds, and he did this over many months. And he developed real relationships, not transactional where I'm coming just to give you something, relationships. He also looked to identify who were leaders in this neighborhood. And he gradually identified the leaders and worked closely with them and made a greater effort to gain their trust. And when he had trust of the leaders would impart this idea that he could be trusted to everybody else. And eventually he formed 2 advisory boards, one of the more elder statesmen in the neighborhood, but also for students. Meanwhile, he was changing the whole profile of his organization. He was hiring people either from the neighborhood or from nearby. So who he was, what Life Remodel meant to people became different. If most of the staff or many of the staff came from their neighborhood or a similar neighborhood, people would have a different view of who he was, who his organization was. And then he had all these mechanisms. And then he basically had these steps, the name. How did he choose the name? He had people, actually was the students from the neighborhood. They chose the name. What were the organizations that would be invited? What would be the priorities? He enabled the neighborhood to have very major influence on this. So by taking all these steps, he's given the neighborhood a sense of who he is, that he could be trusted. He's basically changing who he is so that people feel that they have a stake in it. And he's doing all these things so people feel that they have ownership. That's how you build trust in a low trust place. You have to go through lots of these steps. You just can't show up. It's not about what you're offering. It's about who you are, who the people are. And you start from the who, and then the who becomes the when. When are we ready? Only later do you get to the what and the how. And I think it's really important that if we don't think in terms of the who and then the when, and we just jump to the what and the how, which is what most nonprofits do, you're lining yourself up potentially for failure.
So what you were talking about is really about building relationships and inserting yourself into the community, into the neighborhood, and participating in that environment too as a way to build trust. And you talk about the 5 stages of trust building in the article, which I think you outlined as you went through your answer. It's hard for nonprofits sometimes to make those initial steps, because building trust, building relationships, and being embedded or being in those environments takes a lot of commitment and energy.
It takes a different mindset. I mean, one of the problems of the nonprofit world, it tends to be, there's reasons why it became this way, logical reasons, but because it's so professional, because it's so focused on specific goals, because they tend to be very focused on material outcomes. They tend to be very siloed in their approaches. They tend to be very short-term in their approaches. And they tend to be very distant in their approaches. And real relationship building, trust building, and for me, real change has to be none of those things.
This has really been a great conversation so far with Seth Kaplan. And I just want to remind you that this is part one of the full conversation that we had with him. So make sure you tune back in when the next podcast of Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom drops in a couple of weeks. And you'll hear us continue that conversation that we started with Seth today. Today, we focused mostly on this idea of fragile states and fragile neighborhoods. In the next section of this podcast, in part two, we're going to take a look at the role of civil conversation and civil dialogue in addressing both fragile states and fragile neighborhoods. But we want to close out today by just reminding you that we ended season one, and we actually learned a whole lot from doing season one. And so, Lamar, let's take a couple of minutes to cue folks in on what we hope is different about season two. So first, we're hoping to drop. Are you ready? Two podcasts per month, roughly every other week, right?
That sounds great. It sounds like we need to get ourselves scheduled, our lives a little bit here.
We need to get our acts together, man.
That's right. A second, though, we're going to prioritize having guests speak on topics that we are exploring. We're going to continue to explore. Tom and I will continue to dig and provide content for the podcast about having civil conversation. But we want to bring guests on as well to speak to those topics and broaden kind of the understanding and the ideas around those topics. So if you have suggestions for people you would like for us to invite onto the podcast, send us an email. You can email me at lamar.thirdspace@gmail.com or tom.thirdspace@gmail.com.
All right. And number three, we are going to continue to do both versions of the podcast. Now, what we mean by that is we have an audio version that you can find on platforms such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Amazon Music and platforms such as that. And we're also going to continue doing a video version that we'll be offering on the Tenacious Change YouTube channel. So if you want to see what we look like, and yes, we are just devilishly handsome, by the way. But if you want to see what we look like and what our habitats look like as we are doing this podcast and see some of the faux pas that occur in the middle of doing the podcast, tune into the YouTube channel and you can watch us there.
We don't have any faux pas.
None.
Not
whatsoever.
None. Finally, we are going to continue to be nonpartisan in a very tense election year. This is going to be an interesting year for sure. It's going to be a tough one, but we're going to continue to be nonpartisan. But we do retain our bias for all Hawkeye sports at the University of Iowa. Go Hawks.
Absolutely. Go Hawks. Okay. Well, hey, Lamar, we'll see you next time, okay?
All right. Take care, man.
All right. Bye. Tom here. Thank you for listening to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom. Remember to click on subscribe to be sure you get notices about new episodes. Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom is a production of Tenacious Change. Opinions and ideas expressed in this podcast are solely those of Lamar Roth and Tom Klaus. And we'd like to hear your opinions and ideas too. You can leave us a voice message on Spotify, or you can email us at the addresses found in the show notes. Also, in the show notes, you can find links to some of the things we talked about today, so you can check them out for yourself. Until next time, keep moving toward third space.